Okay, this video is going to be covering loops, and loops are ways to execute a line of code more than once without having to retype it out over and over again. So for example, if you wanted to do this 5 times, you would have to, do it 5 times. We saw earlier with the function how you could have a function that calls itself, and you could sort of loop that way, where you could execute the same line of code over and over again without actually calling it, like we did in the countdown. But in this video, I'm going to be showing you an easier way to do loops, and that is with the for loop. So the for loop is a very common type loop. It's in all programming languages. A lot of languages, the syntax looks the exact same. Like in PHP, if you ever learned PHP, you would recognize that it almost looks the exact same. So it starts off like this. So this is a basic starting syntax for the for loop. And then inside the parentheses here is the code that you want to execute for each iteration of the for loop. And then inside the parentheses, you sort of set up your for loop. You describe to JavaScript how to loop and how many times to loop. So the first thing you put is a variable. Let I is equal to 0, semicolon, space. So you have a variable I, it's equal to 0. I is short for index, so it's like the index of your loop. So, and then next you put the condition. So the condition is like an if statement. If that if statement runs true, it executes your code inside once. So let's say if I is less than 10, semicolon, space. And then the last thing you have to do is an incrementer. So right now I is equal to 0, and it's basically always 0. So this loop would run forever, which you don't want that, because a loop that runs forever, it'll just crash your browser, everything will become unresponsive. You don't want that to happen, it's not good. So at the end you say I plus plus, which just increments I by 1. That's what that does. So actually if we run this, it will run this 10 times. One thing that you could do here is you could just const.log I. So it just logs 0 to 9. And if you want to check if it's less than or equal to, then the 10 will be inclusive. And you can make this be 100 too. Great. Okay, so I got this array here, this nerds array, and loops are really great for looping through an array. I would actually give it a challenge to you just to try, because you've already seen everything that I'm about to do to loop through this array, you've already seen before. So my challenge for you is to loop through this entire array, and for each value, log the person's name. So the loop would execute 4 times, and for each time, it would show the person's name. So try to do that. Pause the video, think about it, think about how you would do it, and now I'm going to show you how to do it. So when you're looping, you want to loop through the array. So you don't want to loop 100 times. You want to loop only the amount of times, basically the length of your array. So nerds.length. So this is like if I is less than 4. So it will loop 4 times, because I starts off at 0. And then you want to console.log nerds, and then which index do you want to log? You just want to log I. And this is equal to, I did that, it shouldn't be there anymore. Okay, I'm going to have to redo that. Nope, this looks good. Okay, I don't know what just happened, but there it is. You're logging all 4 people. And if you add another one here, without changing your for loop at all, it will just run 5 times now. So it's really flexible like that. Like once you have the for loop written, your nerds array or any array could be as big as you want, and the loop will always just execute for each element in that array. Okay, and before I end the video, there's also a while loop, which honestly I don't use very often. I don't see it used very often. A lot of things that you could do when looping, you can do with a for loop. Although I guess when it comes to syntax, I could think of times where the while loop is better, but it just doesn't come up very often. But I'm going to show you how you could use a while loop. And I actually think it's simpler than a for loop. You just say while, and then inside here, let's just say do this. And so while takes in only one thing. Unlike a for loop where you take in 3 things, a while just takes one thing, and it's sort of like an if statement, where if that value evaluates to true, it continues the loop. So what happens is it checks if number is true, and it is, it logs. And then it does it again. It checks if number is true. So how this works is it turns number, it coerces it into a Boolean, so it becomes either truthy or falsy, and if it's truthy, it runs this code. Then after it runs the code, it checks if this is truthy still. And if it is, it runs the code. And it just keeps going back and forth. It runs the code, and then it checks, then it runs the code and checks, and it keeps running the code until this becomes falsy. So if I clicked run right now, it would crash my browser. I might not crash it immediately, but the browser would become unresponsive, and I wouldn't be able to really do anything. I don't even think I'd be able to stop the running. So inside here, you have to do something that will eventually make this condition not truthy. So you just say number minus minus, which just reduces one value from the number. Okay, so now when we run this code, it will work. It will do this. It will do that 10 times or however many times it is. If we log number, we get C. Okay, so 10 all the way to 1. And this is basically a while loop. It's not used as much as a for loop, I think, because it needs to use an outside variable. Unlike a for loop where you create the variable and you sort of create the variable inside the for loop. Here, you have to have a number already existing. And also, it seems to me that when you're writing a while loop, it's a lot easier to accidentally run an infinite loop, which is when the loop runs forever. I mentioned that it would crash your browser and become unresponsive. It seems like it's a lot easier to do that accidentally with a while loop than it is with a for loop. Because if you just forgot to do this, your whole thing would crash. With a for loop, you usually always do I++ at the end of the loop, and that just will prevent any infinite loop from happening. Okay, so that's going to be it for this one. I'm done.